So, what's the difference between a strong culture and a weak culture? So, weak culture is one where there's really no personality or energy at the office, where you come in and you don't get a sense of what the company's about. A strong culture is the opposite, where you walk in and you get a really great sense that there's something happening there and you really understand the energy. So for example, if you walked into electronic arts, there's people playing pool, there's people standing in the hallways having conversations, there's little coffee shops where people are engaged in creative discussion, and you really get a sense that this is a relaxed, creative kind of environment and atmosphere. So that would be an example of a strong, positive culture. Now, sometimes, though, there can be a strong culture and it's not positive. For example, if there's a culture where people are very tense and stressed, they work late, they work hard, it's very formal, and then you would feel more the tension and the negative culture, but it would still be strong. So we need to understand, how do we build this kind of a culture and make sure it is a strong but positive culture? And how do you know what the culture is? So we can read it in a number of different ways. The first one is stories. People repeat stories. Stories are memorable and we can relate to them, and they usually have an emotional factor to them. So when you join a company, if they tell you a story about someone who did something or what the CEO did a few years ago, there's always a message and meaning in that that'll help define some of the rules and requirements and norms of the organization. Rituals is another one. For example, we had beer night on Friday afternoons. We would order pizza, have some beers, and everybody would connect and be social and kind of get to know each other better. And that was a ritual to show that we wanted to have a culture that worked hard but also played hard. In terms of symbols, these are usually visual things. They could be around the office. You know, if you walked into a reception room and there was a big photo of the CEO, it would tell you a little bit about something about that CEO and the company culture. If instead you came into a company and there was a row of photos of the employee of the month, you would quickly realize that that was a company that really valued people and teamwork. And you would get a very different sense of that culture. So symbols are important. And finally, language. How we speak, what we say, the words that we choose can really impact a culture. For example, if we talked about being risky and taking chances and trying new things and being creative and pushing past the status quo, you would have a culture that was very open to that. If instead we talked about, not doing this or being careful not to get in trouble or cover your butt, language like that would mean that there's a very different culture that's risk averse and it's not safe to innovate and be dynamic. So how does this culture form that we're talking about? So it usually comes from the top, the founders, the CEO, the executive. They have values and beliefs and they pass those downward to the rest of the organization. And they hire people that are like them, that have similar values and beliefs. And that way they perpetuate and keep that culture longer term. And then when new people are hired and brought on, they either fit in or pretty much leave over time. And the selection process is important. And we want to make sure there's a good fit between you and our culture. If there isn't, there's just going to be conflict and issues. And you won't be happy and we won't be happy with you. There's norms of behavior that are clearly communicated both at a lateral level and a vertical level. And also there's a degree of socialization that happens where when new people are brought in, they're indoctrinated into the ways of the company and told and shown how to be and how to do things. So the socialization process happens before you even take the job, during an interview where expectations are very clearly laid out. They might talk about the values of the company and make sure that there's a fit between you and the culture. Then once you get the job, there's a tremendous amount of information that's passed on. and you get this sort of vicariously by watching other people or by getting into trouble by not fitting in and doing the right thing. So we kind of adapt and morph into what's required of us over time. So as long as we go through this sort of socialization process, we'll end up being very productive, we'll feel committed and connected to the organization, and hopefully have low turnover. There's lots of different ways we can be socialized, formally through a training session or website, training program. There might be manuals, or it could just be informal, where someone talks to us and says, hey, you should know that we do this way. And don't ever hand in your expense report late, because, that's not cool. Or it might be individual, just one-on-one, or it could be a group of new staff or team being trained on these values and beliefs and morals and ethical behaviors of the organization. Sometimes it's a straight up in the beginning, other times it's variable over time. And it might be very organized, or it could just be a random conversation in the hallway. And we get this socialization process subconsciously and consciously while we're working with the organization. Here's a bit more detail you can read and pause on each of these types of socialization options that I've talked about. Now, culture is really difficult to change. So if you have a good culture, that's great. It's easy to maintain that. However, if you have a strong, poor, or weak culture, negative, I should say, then it's really difficult to change it. It's kind of like me saying to you that you have a personality that doesn't work and you should change that. It's very difficult to consciously choose our personality or change our personality. And an organization is the same. So one key barrier is that there's resistance from inside the people as well as within the organizational structure. And when there's lots of change, people get resistant and uncomfortable with change. So that's a real issue. And if you're trying to, say, make the company more agile and responsive to market needs, and meanwhile you have a culture that's very formal and policy driven, those two will be in conflict with each other and will get in the way of creating that change that you desire. Now, diversity can also be an issue. Different cultures put pressure on people that are different and expect everyone to be the same, to align with the norms of the organization. And that could be challenging for some people. And culture is also a huge barrier in terms of having successful mergers or acquisitions. If two cultures are very different, one might be organic and dynamic and creative and work in teams. The other one might be much more, siloed and independent and competitive. And then bringing those two companies together, you have a real challenge trying to overcome the differences in the culture and the dynamics that are opposing each other. So how do you merge two cultures? You could assimilate. Okay, so the whole organization determines which culture they're going to take on, and they work towards creating that. You could run the two organizations separately and leverage, the good things in both their separate cultures and different cultures. Or you could try to integrate them and have a bit of a hybrid, where it's a little bit of one culture and a little bit of the other, and you kind of take the best of both to create something new and interesting that works for everyone in the organization, that becomes sort of a third new form of culture. So I already mentioned that changing culture is very difficult, and one of the core things that we can use as a leverage is either reward or punishment. So we start to reward the behavior we want and try and encourage people to change, or we start punishing the old behavior that we don't want anymore. And we need to be really specific about that. And this has to go right straight from the top to the bottom. You can't try to change the culture at the bottom without changing the top. So when is it a little easier, more likely to be successful to change the culture? If you have a dramatic crisis, let's say there's a layoff of 1,500 people, that would be a good time to change the culture and shift it because there's so much change going on. If there's a new executive or CEO or management team that's brought on, that's usually a good time that the culture starts to change from the top and people will fall in place very quickly to adapt to the new management style. For small, young companies that are growing, they have an opportunity to create that culture and mold it and make it what they want it to be. And of course, if there's a weak culture, there's an opportunity to bring in a strong, positive culture and lay that over top. A strong culture is much easier and more comfortable for people to adapt to than no culture or a weak culture. Ethical issues are important. You want a culture in your organization that rewards and encourages ethical behavior. Often this is not the case in a competitive, high pressure, low risk type of organizations. People feel compelled to have to not tell customers the truth or to hide information because of the risk involved. So changing some of those behaviors will help shift the culture to be more ethical. And most importantly, we really have to practice what we preach and demonstrate the behavior we want. Be really specific about communicating expectations about what is okay and what is not okay. If somebody tries to cheat on an expense report, for example, we can make an example of that person and make it very clear that that's not behavior that'll be tolerated. We can do ethics training. That, of course, is helpful. And as I mentioned, we can reward or punish certain unethical acts and make an example of that for the rest of the people in the organization. And we can put protective mechanisms in, whistleblower policy, opportunities for people to talk to their managers without fear of being reprimanded or being in trouble, or having, a risk of losing their job if they share and disclose the unethical behavior they observed. And of course, we want to create a positive culture. And how we can do that is build on people's strengths, look at their positives. I've got 2 boys, and when they were little, they used to argue and fight. And I used to put a lot of energy into saying, don't hit your brother, don't argue, don't fight. And I realized I was putting more energy into the negative behavior and reinforcing that. So instead, I started to highlight when they were getting along. So I would say, I saw you 2 helping each other put your toys away, and I really appreciated how kind and helpful you were to each other. And I started putting focus and energy into the behavior I wanted as opposed to the behavior I didn't want. So the same principle applies in an organizational perspective. And globally, we run into problems with culture where we have different countries we might be operating in. We might have offices with different ethnic cultures, values, beliefs. They might be a collectivist society that's very group-based. We might be a very independent society where we're used to making decisions. We might be a very formal culture in one country, and we might be informal in North America. So these kinds of differences in values and cultures, in terms of ethnic culture, will affect the corporate culture and might cause problems or conflicts as well. So globally, we have to deal with different cultures across the organization as well. All right, so that's a quick review of organizational culture and some of the key issues. For more information, you can review the chapter, and I'll see you very soon.